The wrapping paper crinkled as my mother handed out the final present to my nephew Jake, his third expensive gift of the evening. Around her gleaming marble floor in Scottsdale, 5 grandchildren sat surrounded by torn ribbons and empty boxes, their faces glowing with Christmas joy. But in the corner of her pristine living room, one small figure remained perfectly still, her hands folded quietly in her lap. My 7-year-old daughter Sophia watched the celebration with those perceptive, brown eyes that seemed to understand far more than any child should have to. She didn't cry. She didn't ask why. She simply observed as her grandmother deliberately ignored her existence, as if my little girl was invisible in a room full of family. But what happened next didn't just change Christmas morning. It changed everything I thought I knew about standing up for the people we love most. And it taught my entire family a lesson none of us will ever forget. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jessica Martinez, and I need to tell you about the Christmas that broke my heart and then put it back together in ways I never expected. I'm 32 years old, and for the past 4 years, it's been just me and my daughter Sophia, building a life together in our small apartment in Tempe, Arizona. Some days are harder than others, especially around the holidays when the weight of being a single mother feels heavier, and the gap between where we are and where I always imagined we'd be seems impossible to bridge. That particular December, morning started like so many others in our little home. Sophia was sitting at our kitchen table, carefully working on what she called her special Christmas project, tongue poking out in concentration as she wrapped something in tissue paper, with the serious dedication only a 7-year-old can possess. The winter sunlight streamed through our apartment windows, catching the dust motes that danced above her dark hair, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. Our Christmas tree, barely 4 feet tall and decorated with ornaments we'd collected from dollar stores and craft projects, stood proudly in the corner next to our secondhand couch. It wasn't much by most people's standards, but it was ours, and Sophia loved it fiercely. I was rushing around trying to get us both ready for the drive to my mother's house in North Scottsdale, that gleaming neighborhood where every home looks like it belongs in a luxury magazine and the holiday decorations cost more than most people's monthly rent. Sophia had been talking about this family Christmas gathering for weeks, asking questions about her cousins and wondering if Grandma Patricia would like the handmade ornament she'd been secretly crafting in her bedroom. The excitement in her voice when she talked about seeing everyone made my stomach twist with anxiety, because I knew something she didn't. I knew that in my mother's world, love came with conditions, and lately Sophia and I had been failing to meet most of them. The drive from our modest neighborhood to my mother's house always felt like crossing into a different universe. We passed from apartment complexes and strip malls to gated communities and desert mansions, the landscape shifting from ordinary to extraordinary in the span of 20 minutes. Sophia pressed her nose against the car window, pointing out the elaborate light displays and commenting on which houses looked like fairy tale castles. She had no idea that each mile we traveled was taking us further away from acceptance and deeper into a world where our worth would be measured against impossible standards. When we pulled into the circular driveway of my mother's house, I sat in the car for an extra moment, watching Sophia's face light up at the sight of the professional holiday display. 3 towering palm trees wrapped in thousands of white lights created a winter wonderland in the desert, while enormous wreaths adorned every window and a life-sized nativity scene graced the front lawn. Everything was perfect, expensive, and designed to impress. My mother, Patricia Williams, had always believed that appearances mattered more than almost anything else, and her home reflected that philosophy in every carefully chosen detail. Inside, the house buzzed with the controlled chaos of a large family gathering. My sister Rachel was holding court in the kitchen, describing her latest vacation to Cabo, while her husband Mark nodded along from his position by the granite island, craft, beer in hand. Their children, Jake, Emma, and little Ben, We're already running through the house with the confidence that comes from knowing you belong somewhere completely and without question. The adults moved around each other with practiced ease, everyone understanding their role in the family hierarchy that had been established years before Sophia was even born. Rachel looked up when we walked in, her smile bright but not quite reaching her eyes. She was wearing a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, her highlights fresh from the salon, and her makeup applied with the skill of someone who had both the time and money to maintain appearances. She hugged me with the kind of embrace that looks warm from the outside but feels hollow when you're on the receiving end, the kind that says all the right things while meaning none of them. My mother emerged from the dining room wearing a silk blouse and her favorite strand of pearls, looking every inch the successful widow who had built a comfortable life through careful planning and strategic relationships. She kissed my cheek, with the same polite affection she might show an acquaintance, then turned her attention to Sophia with a smile that seemed strained around the edges. Patricia had always been complicated, but since my divorce from David 4 years ago, our relationship had shifted from difficult to nearly impossible. When I was married and living in a nice house with a successful husband, I was her pride and joy. Now that I was working at a local nonprofit and living paycheck to paycheck, I had become her greatest disappointment. The first few hours passed in the familiar rhythm of forced family togetherness. Conversations centered around Rachel's latest achievements, Mark's expanding dental practice, and my mother's upcoming cruise to the Greek islands. When people asked about my life, I mentioned Sophia's excellent grades and my work with the community outreach program, but I could see their polite disinterest. The real tension lived in the spaces between words, in the way conversations paused when I entered a room, in the subtle corrections of Sophia's behavior, while identical actions from her cousins went unnoticed. Sophia, oblivious to the undercurrents of adult dysfunction, played happily with Jake and Emma, her laughter mixing with theirs as they ran between the formal living room and the backyard pool area. She helped little Ben build a tower with blocks, praised Emma's new dance moves, and listened with genuine interest as Jake explained the rules of his favorite video game. Watching her interact with her cousins, I was struck by how naturally kind she was, how easily she offered encouragement and inclusion to others. It made what happened later all the more painful. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dinner was served in my mother's formal dining room, where crystal glasses caught the light from an elaborate chandelier, and every piece of silverware had been polished to perfection. The table could easily seat 12, but tonight it held our family of 9 with room to spare. Sophia sat between me and Ben, carefully using her napkin and saying, "Please and thank you" with the manners I'd worked hard to teach her. She complimented my mother on the meal, asked thoughtful questions about everyone's lives, and shared stories about school that made the adults smile despite themselves. But I could feel the judgment simmering beneath the surface. When Sophia accidentally knocked over her water glass, my mother's sharp intake of breath conveyed more criticism than words ever could. When she reached for the salt without asking, Rachel's raised eyebrows spoke volumes about proper etiquette. These were normal childhood moments, the kind of minor mistakes that usually pass without comment. But in this house, they became evidence of inadequate parenting, proof that I was failing to raise my daughter according to the family's exacting standards. After dinner, we moved to the living room where my mother's Christmas tree dominated the space like a work of art. 12 feet tall and professionally decorated in silver and white, it was surrounded by what looked like hundreds of perfectly wrapped presents. The children's eyes grew wide at the sight, and I felt my stomach drop as I realized the magnitude of what was about to unfold. This wasn't just gift-giving. This was a display of wealth and favoritism that would leave invisible scars on the children who didn't measure up. My mother positioned herself by the tree like a queen holding court, reading each gift tag with theatrical flair before calling the lucky recipient forward. Jake received a new laptop for his homework, along with noise-canceling headphones and a gift card to his favorite gaming store. Emma unwrapped a professional-quality easel with art supplies that cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. Little Ben, despite being only 5 years old, received a collection of educational toys that were clearly chosen to give him advantages in school. With each present distributed, my heart sank further. Sophia sat cross-legged on the carpet, clapping, enthusiastically for her cousins and genuinely celebrating their good fortune. She showed no signs of jealousy or resentment, just pure happiness for the people she loved. But I could see her scanning the remaining presents under the tree, looking for familiar handwriting or a package that might have her name. As the pile grew smaller and the living room filled with discarded wrapping paper, the terrible truth became impossible to ignore. There was nothing for Sophia. Not a single present. Not even a small token or a card acknowledging her presence. My mother had deliberately and methodically excluded my daughter from Christmas morning, and she had done it in front of the entire family without a trace of shame or regret. The realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and making my hands shake with suppressed anger. That's when my sister Rachel looked directly at me from her position on the leather sofa, her voice carrying clearly across the room despite the background noise of children playing with new toys. Her words were delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that comes naturally to people who have never questioned their own privilege, spoken as if she was sharing an interesting observation rather than delivering a devastating blow. Well, maybe if some people made better life choices, their kids wouldn't have to learn about disappointment so early, she said, taking a sip from her wine glass while maintaining eye contact with me. The comment hung in the air like poison, designed to look like concern while actually being a calculated attack. She was referring to my divorce, my financial struggles, my decision to leave David when I discovered his affairs rather than staying for the sake of appearances. In Rachel's world, a woman's worth was measured by her ability to keep a successful man, regardless of how that man treated her. The room didn't fall silent, but the energy shifted in that uncomfortable way that happens when someone crosses a line that can't be uncrossed. Mark looked down at his phone, suddenly fascinated by something on the screen. The children continued playing, unaware that their aunt had just publicly humiliated their cousin's mother. But the adults all heard it, and their lack of response spoke volumes about where their loyalties lay. My mother, still standing by the tree with an empty gift box in her hands, didn't miss a beat. She actually smiled, as if Rachel had just said something particularly clever and added her own devastating commentary to the moment. Her voice carried the kind of authority that comes from years of being the matriarch of a family that valued appearances above authenticity. "Some lessons are harder to learn than others," Patricia said, her tone suggesting that Sophia's exclusion was actually a valuable educational experience. It builds character when children understand that the world doesn't owe them anything. Sophia's getting an early education in reality, which is probably more valuable than any toy we could give her. She handed Jake another present as she spoke, his fourth gift of the evening, while glancing pointedly in my direction. The message was unmistakably clear. This wasn't an oversight or an accident. This was a deliberate choice, a calculated decision to punish my daughter for my perceived failures as a woman, a mother, and a member of this family. In Patricia's mind, Sophia's exclusion was justified because I had disappointed them all by refusing to maintain a marriage that was slowly destroying my soul. I sat frozen on my mother's expensive couch, feeling the familiar paralysis that had plagued me since childhood whenever conflict arose in this house. Years of conditioning had taught me that keeping the peace was more important than standing up for myself. That causing a scene was worse than enduring injustice. That good daughters didn't challenge their mothers regardless of how wrong those mothers might be. But this wasn't about me anymore. This was about my child, my innocent 7-year-old daughter who had done nothing wrong except exist in a family that had decided she was somehow less worthy of love because her mother had chosen dignity over dysfunction. I looked at Sophia, expecting to see tears or confusion, or the kind of devastation that would justify me finally finding my voice. But what I saw instead stopped me cold. She was sitting perfectly still, her small hands folded in her lap, her expression calm and thoughtful. She wasn't crying. She wasn't asking questions. She wasn't even looking at me for explanations or comfort. Instead, she was watching the adults in the room with those wise brown eyes, taking in every word, every glance, every subtle signal that told her exactly where she stood in this family's hierarchy. In that moment, I realized something that broke my heart completely. Sophia already understood. At 7 years old, my daughter had already learned what it felt like to be treated as less than, to be tolerated instead of celebrated, to be excluded from love because of circumstances beyond her control. She had absorbed the lessons this family had been teaching through their actions, their silences, and their carefully orchestrated rejections. And somehow, instead of breaking her spirit, it had made her stronger. But what happened next changed everything. What Sophia did next defied every expectation I had about how a 7-year-old would handle such blatant rejection. Instead of melting into tears or running to me for comfort, she stood up with the kind of quiet dignity that would have impressed royalty. Her movements were deliberate and calm as she brushed invisible dust from her red velvet dress, the one we had found at Target on clearance that she had insisted was perfect for Christmas because it made her feel like a princess. She walked across the room with purpose, her small feet silent on the marble floor, while the adults continued their conversations as if nothing significant was happening. I watched in fascination and growing pride as my daughter approached her small backpack, which she had placed carefully by the front door when we arrived. She had insisted on bringing it, telling me it contained important Christmas things that she couldn't leave at home. At the time, I had assumed she meant coloring books or small toys to keep herself occupied during the long adult conversations that dominated these family gatherings. But as she unzipped the main compartment and began carefully removing items, I realized she had been planning something far more meaningful. From the depths of her backpack, Sophia pulled out 3 small packages, each one wrapped with the endearing imperfection that only comes from a child's determined efforts. The paper was uneven in places, with strips of tape applied at odd angles and corners that didn't quite meet properly. But there was something beautiful about the obvious care that had gone into each wrapping job. The way she had tried so hard to make everything look special, despite her limited resources and small fingers that struggled with precision. The living room gradually grew quieter as people began to notice what was happening. Jake looked up from his new laptop, curiosity replacing the absorption he had shown in exploring his expensive gift. Emma paused in her examination of the art supplies, following everyone's gaze to where Sophia stood, holding her homemade presents. Even little Ben stopped playing with his educational toys long enough to watch his cousin with the kind of innocent interest that children show when something unexpected captures their attention. My mother, Patricia, was still standing by the Christmas tree, but her theatrical gift-giving performance had come to an abrupt halt. The empty box she had been holding slipped from her fingers and landed softly on the pile of discarded wrapping paper at her feet. Her perfectly styled gray hair caught the light from the chandelier above, and for the first time all evening, she looked genuinely surprised rather than smugly in control of every social interaction. Rachel had gone completely still on the sofa, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips as she watched her niece with an expression that cycled between confusion and something that might have been apprehension. Mark had finally looked up from his phone, his eyebrows raised in the way that suggested he was witnessing something he hadn't anticipated. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as Sophia approached her first recipient. She walked directly to Emma, her 11-year-old cousin who had always been kind to her despite the family tensions that swirled around the adults. Emma had inherited her mother's blonde hair and her father's gentle demeanor, and she had spent part of the evening showing Sophia some of the dance moves she had learned in her expensive lessons. The two girls had bonded over a shared love of music, with Emma patiently teaching Sophia simple choreography while the adults discussed topics that held no interest for children. "This is for you, Emma," Sophia said softly, holding out the first package with both hands in the formal way children offer gifts when they want to show respect and affection. Her voice carried clearly across the room despite its gentle volume, and there was something almost ceremonial about the way she presented the carefully wrapped bundle. Emma accepted the gift with obvious surprise, looking around the room as if seeking permission or guidance from the adults before carefully peeling back the uneven tape. When she opened the wrapping paper, her face transformed with genuine delight as she discovered a friendship bracelet unlike anything that could be purchased in stores. Sophia had spent weeks working on it in secret, weaving together threads in Emma's favorite colors of purple and silver, creating intricate patterns that spoke of hours of patient work and careful attention to detail. The bracelet was beautiful, in the way that only handmade gifts can be, imperfect but infused with love and intention. Small beads had been incorporated into the design, spelling out Emma's name in delicate lettering, and tiny charms had been added at strategic points to catch the light when worn. It was the kind of present that money couldn't buy, because its value lay not in its materials but in the time, thought, and affection that had gone into its creation. "Sophia, this is gorgeous," Emma breathed, holding the bracelet up to admire the way the beads caught the Christmas tree lights. "Did you really make this yourself? It must have taken forever." Her genuine appreciation was evident in every word, and she immediately began fastening the bracelet around her wrist with the wah kind of careful reverence usually reserved for precious jewelry. But Sophia was already moving toward her next recipient. She approached little Ben, who was sitting on the floor surrounded by his new educational toys, his 5-year-old attention span already beginning to waver despite the excitement of Christmas morning. Ben had always been the baby of the cousin group, and Sophia had taken on an almost protective role with him during family gatherings, helping him reach things that were too high, and including him in games when the older children grew impatient with his slower understanding. "This one is yours, Ben," Sophia said, kneeling down to his level and offering the second package with the same ceremonial care she had shown Emma. Ben's face lit up with excitement as he accepted the gift, his small hands working eagerly to remove the wrapping paper with the kind of enthusiastic destruction that only young children can manage. Inside, he found a handmade comic book that took my breath away with its creativity and attention to detail. Sophia had spent countless hours drawing and writing a story featuring Ben as the main character, a superhero named Super Ben, who used his kindness and intelligence to help people in trouble. The illustrations were remarkably sophisticated for a 7-year-old, showing clear evidence of natural artistic talent that I hadn't fully appreciated until that moment. Each page had been carefully colored and laminated using supplies from my office, creating a professional-looking book that rivaled anything that could be found in stores. The story itself was charming and age-appropriate, featuring adventures where Super Ben saved cats from trees, helped lost children find their parents, and used his special powers of empathy to solve problems that adults couldn't understand. It was clear that Sophia had put tremendous thought into creating something that would specifically appeal to her youngest cousin's interests and personality. "Look, Mama, I'm a superhero," Ben exclaimed, holding up the comic book for Rachel to see. His excitement was infectious, and even the adults couldn't help but smile at his obvious delight. He immediately began flipping through the pages, pointing out details in the illustrations and asking questions about the story that demonstrated how thoroughly Sophia had captured his imagination. But it was the third package that created the moment everyone would remember long after the Christmas decorations were packed away. Sophia turned toward my mother with the same calm dignity she had shown throughout the entire gift-giving process, walking across the living room with measured steps that seemed far too mature for her 7 years. The room fell into complete silence as she approached Patricia, who stood frozen by the Christmas tree like a statue carved from expensive marble. "This is for you, Grandma Patricia," Sophia said simply, offering the final package with both hands extended in a gesture that somehow managed to convey both respect and quiet challenge. There was no accusation in her voice, no hint of the hurt that any adult would have felt after being so deliberately excluded from the family's celebration. Instead, there was just a child offering a gift to her grandmother with the kind of pure intention that cuts through pretense and reaches straight to the heart of truth. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the package, and for the first time all evening, her carefully composed expression cracked to reveal something vulnerable underneath. The confident matriarch who had orchestrated the entire evening's event suddenly looked uncertain, as if she was holding something that might explode if handled incorrectly. The weight of the moment seemed to settle on her shoulders as she realized that every person in the room was watching her response to this unexpected gesture. She unwrapped the package with uncharacteristic care, her usually efficient movements slowed by what appeared to be genuine apprehension. When the paper fell away, she found herself holding a small picture frame containing a drawing that would haunt her long after Christmas was over. The artwork was sophisticated beyond Sophia's years, showing an understanding of human relationships that spoke to wisdom far beyond what any 7-year-old should possess. The drawing depicted our entire family gathered around a Christmas table, but there was something profoundly disturbing about the composition that took a moment to fully register. Everyone was there, carefully rendered in Sophia's distinctive artistic style, but the positioning told a story that none of us wanted to acknowledge. Patricia sat alone at one end of the table, separated from the rest of the family by empty space that seemed to stretch like an unbridgeable chasm. The other family members were clustered together at the opposite end, their faces bright with smiles, and their bodies turned toward each other in gestures of inclusion and warmth. But Patricia's figure sat in isolation, her expression blank and her body language suggesting disconnection from the joy surrounding her. The message was subtle but unmistakable. When you choose to exclude others, you ultimately exclude yourself. From the love and connection that makes family meaningful, at the bottom of the drawing, written in Sophia's careful 7-year-old handwriting, were words that would echo in Patricia's mind for days to come. When you leave someone out, you leave yourself out too. The simple sentence contained a truth so profound that it cut through years of justification and rationalization, forcing my mother to confront the consequences of her choices in a way that no adult confrontation ever could. Dorsturcham Part 3. The silence that spoke volumes. The silence that followed Sophia's gift presentation was unlike anything I had ever experienced in my mother's house. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of contentment or the peaceful pause of satisfaction after a good meal. This was the heavy, suffocating silence that descends when uncomfortable truths are finally spoken aloud, when the carefully constructed facades that families build to hide their dysfunction are suddenly stripped away by the innocent honesty of a child who doesn't yet understand that some truths are supposed to remain hidden. Patricia stared at the drawing as if it contained some kind of secret code that she couldn't quite decipher. Her face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, and I could see her hands shaking slightly as she held the frame. For a woman who prided herself on always having the right response to every social situation, she appeared completely at a loss for words. The confident matriarch, who had spent the evening dispensing gifts like royal favors, had been reduced to speechless contemplation by a 7-year-old's artwork. Rachel had set down her wine glass with a sharp clink against the glass side table, the sound abnormally loud in the oppressive quiet. She kept opening her mouth as if to say something, then closing it again when no appropriate words emerged. Her usual arsenal of cutting remarks and social maneuvering seemed useless against the simple honesty of Sophia's message. Mark had abandoned all pretense of looking at his phone and was staring openly at his mother-in-law, clearly struggling to process what had just occurred. The children seemed to sense that something significant was happening, even if they couldn't fully understand the adult implications of the moment. Jake had closed his laptop and was watching the adults with the kind of alert attention that suggested he was beginning to grasp that his cousin had just done something remarkable. Emma was absently fingering her new friendship bracelet while looking between Sophia and Patricia with obvious concern. Little Ben, still clutching his superhero comic book, had grown unusually still as he picked up on the tension that seemed to radiate from every adult in the room. But it was Sophia herself who commanded the most attention, standing in the center of the living room with a composure that seemed impossible for someone her age. She wasn't fidgeting or looking around nervously like most children would when faced with such an intense adult reaction. Instead, she waited patiently for her grandmother's response, her hands clasped behind her back and her expression serene. There was something almost otherworldly about her calm presence in the midst of so much emotional turbulence. I found myself studying my daughter's face, searching for signs of the hurt or confusion that any normal child would feel after being excluded from Christmas morning. But what I saw instead was something that made my heart swell with pride even as it broke for the experiences that had shaped her into someone capable of such grace under pressure. Sophia had learned to navigate emotional minefields with a skill that most adults never master, developing an inner strength that allowed her to respond to cruelty with kindness and to meet rejection with generosity. Minutes passed without anyone speaking, and the silence began to take on a weight that felt almost physical. The cheerful Christmas music playing softly in the background seemed increasingly inappropriate, its message of joy and celebration standing in stark contrast to the uncomfortable reckoning that was unfolding in the living room. The lights on, the Christmas tree continued to twinkle merrily, but their festive glow felt hollow and meaningless in the face of the emotional devastation that Sophia's simple gift had unleashed. Finally, Patricia found her voice, though when she spoke, it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Sophia, she began, then stopped, apparently unable to complete whatever thought she had been trying to express. She looked down at the drawing again, her eyes tracing the careful lines that her granddaughter had used to illustrate a truth that cut deeper than any accusation ever could. The realization of what she had done seemed to be dawning on my mother in slow, painful waves. For years, she had justified her treatment of me and Sophia by telling herself that she was teaching valuable lessons about consequences and responsibility. She had convinced herself that her conditional love was actually a form of tough guidance that would ultimately make us stronger and more successful. But Sophia's drawing forced her to see the situation from a different perspective, to understand that her actions hadn't just hurt her intended targets, but had also isolated her from the very family connections she claimed to value. I watched as Patricia's carefully maintained composure began to crumble, her mask of social perfection slipping to reveal the vulnerable woman underneath. For the first time in years, I saw my mother as she really was, not the confident matriarch, dispensing wisdom and judgment, but a lonely widow who had allowed pride and disappointment to poison her relationships with the people who should have mattered most to her. The irony wasn't lost on me that it had taken my 7-year-old daughter to teach my mother lessons about family and inclusion that she should have learned decades ago. Sophia had accomplished something that years of arguments and confrontations had failed to achieve. She had held up a mirror that forced Patricia to see herself not as she imagined she was, but as her actions had revealed her to be. As the silence stretched on, I began to feel a familiar stirring of the protective instincts that had been dormant for too long. Watching my mother struggle with the consequences of her choices was satisfying in one sense, but seeing my daughter stand there waiting for a response that might never come was breaking my heart. Sophia had shown incredible courage and wisdom in the way she had handled this situation, but she was still just a child who deserved to be protected from the full weight of adult dysfunction. The paralysis that had kept me frozen on the couch for so many years began to lift as I realized that this moment was bigger than just Christmas morning. This was about the kind of mother I wanted to be and the kind of environment I wanted my daughter to grow up believing she deserved. Sophia had shown me what real strength looked like, and now it was my turn to find the courage to stand up, not just for her, but for both of us. Part 4. Finding my voice. The realization hit me like lightning striking through storm clouds, sudden and illuminating and impossible to ignore. As I sat on my mother's expensive leather sofa, watching my 7-year-old daughter stand with quiet dignity in front of a room full of adults who had failed her, I understood that this moment would define not just our Christmas, but potentially our entire future relationship with this family. More importantly, it would determine what kind of example I was setting for Sophia about standing up for herself and the people she loved. For too many years, I had allowed myself to be diminished by the people who should have supported me most. I had absorbed their criticisms and internalized their disappointments until I began to believe that maybe they were right about my failures and shortcomings. When David left me for his young assistant, taking most of our assets and leaving me to rebuild my life from scratch, my family's response had been to treat my divorce as evidence of my inadequacy rather than recognition of my strength in choosing self-respect over comfortable misery. I had accepted their judgment because part of me believed I deserved it. I had bought into the narrative that good women find ways to make their marriages work regardless of their husband's behavior, that successful people don't end up living in modest apartments and working for nonprofits. I had allowed my mother and sister to make me feel ashamed of the choices that had actually demonstrated my integrity and courage, choices that had protected both me and Sophia from a toxic environment that would have slowly poisoned our souls. But watching Sophia handle this situation with such grace and wisdom forced me to see everything through different eyes. Here was my daughter, facing deliberate cruelty and exclusion from the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally. And instead of crumbling or lashing out, she had responded with a gesture of profound generosity and truth-telling. She had found a way to hold up a mirror that forced the adults in the room to confront the ugliness of their behavior without ever raising her voice or saying a harsh word. If my 7-year-old could show that kind of strength and moral clarity in the face of injustice, what excuse did I have for continuing to accept treatment that was slowly eroding my sense of self-worth? How could I continue to model silence and submission when my daughter was demonstrating that there were better ways to respond to people who tried to diminish your value? The thought of Sophia growing up believing that love was something you had to earn through perfect behavior and constant accommodation made my stomach turn. I imagined her at 17, at 27, at 37, still trying to win approval from people who had made it clear that their acceptance came with impossible conditions. I pictured her in relationships where she settled for less than she deserved because she had learned from watching me that women should be grateful for whatever scraps of affection they could collect. That vision of my daughter's potential future was so horrifying that it cut through years of conditioning and fear like a knife through paper. I realized that my silence wasn't protecting her from conflict. It was teaching her that conflict was more dangerous than injustice, that keeping peace was more important than maintaining dignity. I was showing her that women should absorb punishment without complaint, that children should accept whatever treatment adults chose to dispense, regardless of how unfair or hurtful it might be. The irony was devastating. In my efforts to shield Sophia from the family drama that had shaped my own childhood, I had actually been exposing her to something worse. The lesson that people who love you are allowed to treat you badly, and that your role is to smile and accept whatever they choose to give while never asking for more. I had been so afraid of creating tension that I had failed to create boundaries, so worried about protecting her from conflict that I had failed to protect her from harm. Standing up required overcoming decades of programming that had taught me to value harmony over honesty, appearance over authenticity. My mother had raised me to believe that good daughters don't cause scenes, don't embarrass their families, don't air their grievances in public. Rachel had reinforced these lessons by demonstrating that conformity was rewarded while independence was punished. The entire family system had been designed to maintain the status quo, to preserve the hierarchy that kept certain people in power, while others remained grateful for whatever consideration they received. But Sophia had just shown me that there was another way to navigate these treacherous waters. She had spoken truth without cruelty, had expressed her pain without attacking others, had demanded recognition without losing her dignity. She had found a way to be heard that didn't require her to become smaller or meaner or less than who she was. In her quiet way, she had revolutionized my understanding of what strength could look like. As I prepared to stand up from that couch, I felt the weight of every moment when I had bitten my tongue instead of speaking up, every time I had apologized for things that weren't my fault, every occasion when I had allowed my mother's disappointment to become my shame. But I also felt something else. The fierce, protective love that had sustained me through the darkest moments of single motherhood, the determination that had helped me rebuild my life after divorce, the resilience that had carried both Sophia and me through challenges that would have broken weaker people. My daughter was still standing in the center of the room, waiting with infinite patience for some kind of response to her generous gesture. Patricia was still staring at the drawing as if it contained the secrets of the universe, her face cycling through emotions that she was clearly struggling to process. The other adults remained frozen in their various positions, apparently waiting for someone else to break the spell that Sophia's honesty had cast over the room. That's when I realized that I was done waiting for other people to do the right thing. I was finished hoping that my mother would suddenly develop the capacity for self-reflection and genuine apology. I was through believing that my sister might remember what it felt like to have empathy for people whose lives didn't mirror her own privileged experience. Most importantly, I was no longer willing to sacrifice my daughter's sense of worth on the altar of family peace. The decision crystallized in my mind with surprising clarity, bringing with it a sense of relief that I hadn't felt in years. I was going to stand up, both literally and figuratively. I was going to find my voice after years of enforced silence, and I was going to teach my daughter that love should never require you to accept less than you deserve. Crinkled Soccer Part 5. The Moment of Truth. Rising from my mother's leather couch felt like emerging from underwater after holding my breath for far too long. My legs were unsteady beneath me, partly from the physical act of standing after sitting in tense silence for so long, but mostly from the emotional magnitude of what I was about to do. For the first time in my adult life, I was going to speak my truth to this family without caring about the consequences, without calculating how my words might affect future invitations or family gatherings or my mother's opinion of me. The movement caught everyone's attention immediately. Heads turned in my direction with expressions ranging from curiosity to apprehension, as if they sensed that the careful balance of power in the room was about to shift dramatically. Rachel's eyes widened slightly, perhaps recognizing something in my posture that she hadn't seen before. Mark straightened in his chair, his casual demeanor replaced by the alertness of someone who realizes he might be witnessing something significant. But it was my mother who commanded most of my attention. Patricia looked up from Sophia's drawing with an expression that I had never seen on her face before, a mixture of vulnerability and wariness that suggested she was beginning to understand that her usual tactics of intimidation and control might not work in this situation. For years, she had relied on my desire to maintain family harmony to keep me compliant, knowing that I would swallow my pride and accept whatever treatment she chose to dispense, rather than risk creating permanent rifts in our relationship. Sophia turned toward me with those perceptive brown eyes that seemed to hold far more wisdom than any 7-year-old should possess. In her gaze, I saw not the frightened confusion that most children would display in such a tense situation, but something that looked remarkably like encouragement. It was as if she had been waiting for this moment, hoping that her own demonstration of courage might inspire me to find the strength I had been hiding for so long. The words I had been rehearsing in my mind for years suddenly felt inadequate for the magnitude of what needed to be said. How do you summarize decades of accumulated hurt and disappointment? How do you explain to people who have systematically devalued you that their behavior has consequences that extend far beyond their intentions? How do you make them understand that their cruelty toward your child is not just wrong, but profoundly damaging to the fabric of what family is supposed to represent? I looked around the room at these people who shared my blood, but had forgotten how to share my burdens, who claimed to love me while consistently demonstrating that their love came with conditions I could never meet. They sat in their expensive clothes in their beautiful house, surrounded by the material evidence of their success, apparently oblivious to the emotional poverty that their wealth couldn't disguise. "I need to say something," I began, my voice, quieter than I had intended but carrying clearly across the silence that had settled over the room like a heavy blanket. "I've been sitting here for years, listening to your comments about my choices, your judgments about my life, your subtle and not-so-subtle messages that Sophia and I don't quite measure up to your standards. I've stayed quiet because I thought that keeping peace was more important than keeping my dignity." Rachel shifted uncomfortably on the sofa, her wine glass forgotten in her hand as she realized that this wasn't going to be one of those awkward family moments that could be smoothed over with small talk and forced laughter. Mark was looking everywhere except at me, apparently fascinated by the holiday decorations he had ignored all evening. Even the children seemed to sense that something important was happening, their usual chatter replaced by the kind of attentive silence that comes when they recognize adult conversations that might affect their world. But watching what just happened here tonight, seeing how you deliberately excluded my daughter from Christmas morning while lavishing gifts on her cousins, listening to your cruel comments about disappointment and life lessons, I realized something that I should have understood a long time ago. My voice was growing stronger with each word, fed by years of suppressed anger and hurt that were finally finding their way to the surface. Patricia had set down Sophia's drawing on the mantelpiece, but her eyes kept drifting back to it as if the image was burned into her consciousness. The careful positioning of the figures in Sophia's artwork had captured something that my mother was apparently struggling to deny: the reality that her behavior had isolated her from the very family, connections she claimed to value above all else. "You've spent years making me feel like I'm not enough," I continued, my words gathering momentum as decades of silence finally broke open. "Not successful enough, not married enough, not wealthy enough, not perfect enough to deserve your respect or acceptance. You've criticized my parenting, my career choices, my living situation, my decision to leave a husband who was cheating on me rather than pretend everything was fine for the sake of appearances." The reference to my divorce caused Rachel to flinch visibly, perhaps remembering some of the things she had said about my decision to leave David. In her world, women were supposed to find ways to overlook their husbands' indiscretions if those husbands provided sufficient financial security and social status. The idea that I had chosen self-respect over material comfort was something she had never been able to understand or forgive. "I accepted your judgment because part of me believed that maybe you were right," I admitted, the words tasting bitter but necessary. "Maybe I was a failure for not making my marriage work. Maybe I was selfish for choosing happiness over stability. Maybe Sophia and I deserve to be treated as the poor relations who should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention you decided to throw our way." Mark was now staring openly at me, apparently realizing that his comfortable position as a bystander in family drama was about to become much more complicated. He had always been able to maintain his role as the successful son-in-law by simply staying quiet during these conflicts. But something in my tone suggested that the days of polite silence were coming to an end. "But I won't stay quiet while you do it to her," I said, gesturing toward Sophia, who was still standing in the center of the room with that remarkable composure that made her seem far older than her 7 years. "I won't let you teach my daughter that love is something you have to earn by being perfect, that family acceptance comes with conditions that can be revoked at any time, that her worth is determined by circumstances beyond her control." The why. Words were pouring out of me now, carrying with them the weight of every sleepless night when I had wondered if I was doing enough for my daughter, every moment when I had questioned whether my choices were depriving her of opportunities and advantages that other children took for granted. All the guilt and self-doubt that had been eating away at my confidence for years was finally being transformed into something more powerful: the fierce determination to protect my child from the same emotional wounds that had shaped my own relationship with this family. "Sophia is 7 years old," I said, my voice rising slightly as the full magnitude of their cruelty finally hit me. She's innocent and kind and generous, and she's done nothing to deserve the treatment you've given her tonight. She made beautiful, thoughtful gifts for her cousins and for you, Patricia, because despite everything, she still loves this family and wants to be part of it. And your response was to exclude her from Christmas morning and then justify it as some kind of character-building exercise. I could see tears beginning to form in my mother's eyes, though whether they were tears of shame or frustration or something else entirely, I couldn't tell. For someone who prided herself on maintaining emotional control in all situations, she appeared to be struggling with feelings that were too powerful to contain behind her usual mask of social propriety. That drawing she made for you isn't just a child's artwork, I continued, pointing toward the frame on the mantelpiece. It's a mirror that shows you exactly what you've become. Someone who sits alone at her own family's table because she's forgotten that love isn't supposed to be conditional, that acceptance isn't something people should have to earn by meeting your impossible standards. The silence that followed my words was different from the uncomfortable quiet that had descended after Sophia's gift-giving. This was the silence of reckoning, the moment when carefully constructed justifications crumble under the weight of undeniable truth. Everyone in the room seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next, understanding that relationships were being redefined in ways that couldn't be undone. Sophia walked quietly over to where I stood and slipped her small hand into mine, her fingers warm and steady against my palm. In that simple gesture, I felt more support and validation than I had received from my family in years. My daughter, who had just demonstrated more wisdom and grace than most adults ever manage, was standing with me as I finally found the courage to draw the boundaries that should have been established long ago. "We're leaving," I said, the words coming out with a finality that surprised even me. "But before we go, I want you to understand something. Sophia's gift to you isn't just beautiful artwork. It's an opportunity to see yourself clearly and decide what kind of grandmother you want to be remembered as. You can continue down this path of conditional love and manufactured disappointment, or you can choose to be better. But either way, we're not going to keep showing up to be your emotional punching bags." As I prepared to gather our things and walk out of that house, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the profound relief that comes from finally speaking your truth, regardless of the consequences. The walk to the front door felt like crossing a bridge that was burning behind me with every step. Sophia's hand remained firmly clasped in mine, her small fingers providing an anchor of courage that kept me moving forward, even as part of me wanted to turn around and apologize for disrupting the carefully orchestrated facade of family harmony. But there was no going back now. Not after the words that had been spoken, not after the truths that had been revealed in ways that couldn't be taken back or smoothed over with polite conversation. Our footsteps echoed against the marble floors of my mother's entryway, each sound seeming unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence that followed us from the living room. Behind us, I could hear the murmur of urgent whispered conversations, the kind of damage control discussions that happen when families realize that their dysfunction has been exposed in ways that can't be easily explained away or forgotten. But I didn't turn around to see who was talking, or to catch fragments of what they might be saying about my outburst. At the front door, Sophia paused to gather her small backpack, now empty of the carefully crafted gifts she had spent so much time creating for people who had failed to appreciate either their beauty or their message. She moved with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her entire evening, showing no signs of the emotional turmoil that would have overwhelmed most children her age. Instead, she seemed almost relieved, as if finally leaving this house represented an escape from a burden she had been carrying without complaint. As I reached for the heavy brass door handle, I heard movement behind us and turned to see little Ben running toward us with his new comic book clutched against his chest. His 5-year-old legs carried him quickly across the marble floor, and his face showed the kind of distress that comes when children sense that something important is ending before they fully understand why. "Sophia, wait!" he called out, his voice carrying the urgent tone that children use when they're afraid of losing something precious. He skidded to a stop in front of us, slightly out of breath from his sprint across the house, looking up at E, his older cousin with eyes that held confusion and something that might have been fear. Sophia knelt down to his level, her movements gentle and patient as she waited for him to catch his breath and find the words he wanted to say. There was something beautiful about watching her interact with Ben, the way she naturally adjusted her energy to match his needs, the care she took to make him feel heard and understood, even in the midst of this emotionally charged moment. "Are you leaving because of me?" Ben asked, his voice small and worried. "Did I do something wrong? I really like my comic book, Sophia. I think it's the best present I ever got." His concern was so genuine and innocent that it broke my heart to realize he was blaming himself for the adult dysfunction that had created the situation. "No, sweetie," Sophia said softly, reaching out to smooth down his hair in a gesture that was both protective and reassuring. "You didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes grown-ups forget how to be kind to each other, and when that happens, it's better to go somewhere where kindness lives, but that doesn't mean I don't love you, and it doesn't mean your comic book isn't still special." Ben nodded solemnly, apparently satisfied with this explanation in the way that children can be when the emotional truth of a situation resonates, even if they don't understand all the complicated details. He hugged Sophia fiercely, his small arms wrapping around her with the kind of desperate affection that children show when they're afraid someone important might disappear from their lives. "Will I see you again?" he asked, pulling back to look at her face with the kind of direct question that adults spend years learning how to avoid asking. His innocence was both refreshing and heartbreaking, a reminder of what family relationships could be like if they weren't poisoned by judgment and conditional acceptance. "I hope so," Sophia answered honestly, glancing up at me as if seeking permission to make promises that might be difficult to keep. "But that's something the grown-ups will have to figure out. What I can promise is that I'll always remember how much you liked your comic book, and I'll always be proud that I made something that made you happy." The exchange was interrupted by the appearance of Emma, who had followed her younger brother to the entryway with her new friendship bracelet, still adorning her wrist. At 11, she was old enough to sense the deeper currents of what was happening, and her face showed the kind of mature concern that comes when children are forced to navigate adult conflicts that they don't fully understand, but somehow feel responsible for managing. "Sophia, I'm really sorry about what happened tonight," Emma said, her voice carrying a sincerity that made her seem far older than her years. "I don't think it was fair, and I want you to know that I think your presents were the most special ones here. They were made with love, and that makes them better than anything that comes from a store." Her words carried the weight of genuine empathy, and I found myself wondering how much of the evening's dysfunction she had actually understood. Children are often more perceptive than adults give them credit for, and Emma's response suggested that she had recognized the injustice of Sophia's treatment, even if she lacked the power or authority to do anything about it in the moment. Sophia smiled at her older cousin with genuine warmth, apparently holding no resentment for Emma's inability to speak up during the gift-giving debacle. "Thank you for saying that, Emma. It means a lot to me. And thank you for liking your bracelet so much. I made it thinking about all the times you've been nice to me, so every bead has a good memory inside it." The poetry of my daughter's response took my breath away. Even in this moment of departure and disappointment, she was finding ways to affirm the positive connections she had made, to focus on gratitude rather than grievance. Her emotional intelligence was remarkable for someone her age, but it also made me sad to realize how much practice she had gotten at managing difficult situations with grace and maturity. Emma carefully removed the friendship bracelet from her wrist and pressed it into Ben's small hand. "Here," she said softly. "I want you to have this too, so you'll always remember that Sophia made beautiful things for all of us tonight. Maybe Someday, when you're older, you can give it to someone special and tell them the story about the Christmas when your cousin taught everyone what real presents look like. The gesture was so unexpected and generous that it brought tears to my eyes. In that moment, Emma was demonstrating the kind of wisdom and compassion that the adults in her family had failed to show, recognizing that symbols of love and connection become even more precious when they're shared with others who need them. As we finally stepped out into the cool December night, the contrast between the house's artificially perfect interior and the natural beauty of the Arizona desert was startling. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of sage and creosote that always reminded me why I loved living in this part of the country despite its challenges. Above us, the stars were brilliant in the clear sky, unobscured by the clouds that had seemed to hover over the evening's events. Sophia looked up at the star-filled sky and took a deep breath, as if she was releasing something heavy that she had been carrying inside her chest all evening. "Mom," she said quietly, "I'm proud of you for using your voice tonight. Sometimes it's scary to tell the truth, but it's always right to stand up for people you love." Her words hit me with the force of revelation, making me realize that while I had been worried about protecting her from the family's dysfunction, she had actually been worried about protecting me from my own reluctance to defend myself. My 7-year-old daughter had been carrying the burden of watching her mother be diminished and disrespected, understanding that I was sacrificing my own dignity in a misguided attempt to maintain relationships that were slowly poisoning both of us. The drive home through the quiet streets of Scottsdale and Tempe felt like a journey through different worlds. We passed houses decorated with elaborate Christmas displays, their lights twinkling cheerfully in celebration of a holiday that was supposed to be about love and generosity and inclusion. Each display reminded me of the contrast between the appearance of joy and its actual presence, between families that looked perfect from the outside and those that actually practiced the values they claimed to represent. Sophia was quiet in the passenger seat, occasionally commenting on particularly beautiful light displays or pointing out decorations that caught her imagination. Her mood seemed lighter than it had been all evening, as if walking away from my mother's house had lifted a weight from her shoulders that I hadn't even realized she was carrying. There was something profoundly liberating about choosing authenticity over acceptance, about prioritizing emotional health over social harmony. When we pulled into the parking lot of our apartment complex, the modest buildings looked different to me than they had when we left earlier that evening. Instead of seeing them as evidence of my failure to provide Sophia with the kind of luxurious lifestyle that my sister's children enjoyed, I saw them as symbols of our independence and resilience. We had built a good life here, a life based on genuine love and mutual respect, rather than the conditional approval that had characterized my relationship with my family of origin. Our small apartment welcomed us back with the kind of warmth that has nothing to do with expensive furnishings or professional decorating. The Christmas tree that had seemed so modest compared to Patricia's elaborate display now looked perfect in its simplicity, each ornament telling a story about holidays we had shared, adventures we had taken, or milestones we had celebrated together. This was what family was supposed to feel like: safe, accepting, nurturing, and real. Part 7. The quiet after the storm. The silence in our apartment that night was nothing like the oppressive quiet that had descended over my mother's living room. This was the peaceful silence of sanctuary, the gentle stillness that comes when you finally stop fighting currents that have been pulling you under and allow yourself to float in calmer waters. Sophia changed into her favorite pajamas, the ones with tiny stars scattered across soft blue fabric, and curled up on our secondhand couch with the kind of contentment that comes from being somewhere you truly belong. I made hot chocolate the way we always did on special occasions, with real cocoa powder and tiny marshmallows and a generous dollop of whipped cream that Sophia insisted was essential for proper hot chocolate preparation. The familiar ritual felt almost sacred after the evening's emotional turbulence, a return to traditions that were ours alone and didn't require anyone else's approval or participation. We had created our own family customs over the years, small ceremonies that celebrated our bond and affirmed our values in ways that felt authentic and meaningful. As we sat together on the couch, sipping our hot chocolate and watching the lights twinkle on our modest Christmas tree, Sophia finally began to process the events of the evening in the way that children do when they feel safe enough to express their real thoughts and feelings. Her questions came slowly at first, then with increasing frequency, as she worked through the complex emotions that she had managed so beautifully in the moment, but was only now beginning to fully understand. "Mom, why did Grandma Patricia choose not to give me a present?" she asked, her voice curious rather than hurt, as if she was trying to solve a puzzle rather than nursing a wound. Was it because she doesn't like me, or because she was trying to teach me something, or because she forgot? The question was so direct and innocent that it took my breath away. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that adults sometimes use children as weapons in conflicts that have nothing to do with those children? How do you help a child understand that her grandmother's rejection was actually about punishing me, rather than responding to anything Sophia had done or failed to do? I think Grandma Patricia was confused about what Christmas is supposed to mean, I said carefully, choosing words that would give Sophia a framework for understanding without burdening her with the full weight of adult dysfunction. Sometimes, when grown-ups are hurt or angry about other things, they forget that children should never be part of those feelings. It wasn't about you at all, sweetheart. It was about me, and that's not fair to you. Sophia nodded thoughtfully, apparently satisfied with this explanation in the way that suggested she had already intuited much of the truth. "I felt sad for her," she said after a moment of reflection. "When I was making that drawing, I was thinking about how lonely she must feel when she leaves people out. It's like she's putting herself in a corner and then wondering why nobody wants to sit with her." The wisdom in her observation was staggering. While the adults in the room had been focused on power dynamics and social positioning and the complex web of family resentments, my 7-year-old daughter had been thinking about the emotional consequences of exclusion for the person doing the excluding. She had recognized something that I was only beginning to understand: that cruelty ultimately isolates the person who practices it more than it hurts their intended victims. "What made you decide to give her a present anyway?" I asked, genuinely curious about the thought process that had led to such a generous response to such deliberate rejection. Most children would have responded to being excluded with tears or anger or withdrawal, but Sophia had chosen to offer a gift that forced everyone to confront the reality of what was happening. "I remembered what you always tell me about being the kind of person you want to meet in the world," she said simply. "I wanted to meet someone who would give me a present even if I had been mean to them, so I decided to be that person for Grandma Patricia. And I thought maybe if she could see how it felt to be left out, she might understand why it hurt my feelings." The sophistication of her reasoning was breathtaking. She had processed the situation, identified the core problem, and developed a response that was both emotionally generous and strategically brilliant. Her gift hadn't been a spontaneous gesture of childish goodwill. It had been a carefully considered attempt to create empathy through experience, to help her grandmother understand the consequences of her choices by illustrating them in visual form. "Are you sad that we left early?" I asked, worried that despite her apparent equanimity, she might be feeling regret about missing out on more time with her cousins or the traditional Christmas activities that we had abandoned by walking out. "No," she said without hesitation. "I was starting to feel bad inside my stomach from watching them be mean to you. It made me feel yucky to see people I love hurting each other, and I didn't want to pretend it was okay when it wasn't. Sometimes leaving is the kindest thing you can do for everyone." Her assessment of the situation was remarkably mature, demonstrating an understanding of emotional dynamics that many adults never develop. She had recognized that staying in a toxic environment and pretending everything was fine would have been damaging to all involved, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in dysfunction, even when that refusal causes immediate discomfort. As the evening wore on, We talked about family and love, and the difference between people who care about you and people who just want to control you. Sophia asked thoughtful questions about divorce and money, and the reasons why some adults struggle, to show kindness to people who remind them of their own disappointments. Her curiosity was genuine, and her capacity for forgiveness was remarkable. But she also demonstrated a clear understanding that forgiveness doesn't require you to accept continued mistreatment. "I still love Grandma Patricia and Aunt Rachel," she said as we prepared for bed. "But I don't think I want to spend time with them until they learn how to be nicer. Love doesn't mean you have to let people hurt you, does it, Mom?" The question struck me as profoundly important, not just for a 7-year-old trying to understand family relationships, but for anyone who has ever struggled with the difference between loving someone and enabling their harmful behavior. Sophia had articulated a truth that I had taken decades to understand, that real love sometimes requires boundaries, that caring about someone doesn't mean accepting whatever treatment they choose to dispense. "No, sweetheart," I said, tucking her into bed and smoothing her dark hair across the pillow. "Love means wanting the best for someone, including wanting them to become the kind of person who knows how to treat others with kindness and respect. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step away until they figure that out." As I turned off her bedroom light and watched her settle into sleep, I was struck by the realization that the evening had transformed both of us in ways that we were only beginning to understand. Sophia had discovered that she possessed remarkable courage and wisdom, that she could face injustice with grace and respond to cruelty with compassion without sacrificing her own dignity or accepting unacceptable treatment. For my part, I had finally found the voice that I had been suppressing for years, the strength to stand up not just for my daughter, but for both of us. I had learned that peace built on silence and submission isn't really peace at all, but rather a kind of slow-motion emotional violence that corrodes relationships from the inside out. Most importantly, I had realized that modeling authentic self-respect for my daughter was more important than maintaining artificial harmony with people who had forgotten how to love without conditions. The events of the evening had been painful, but they had also been liberating in ways that I hadn't expected. For the first time in years, I felt like myself again. Like the woman I had been before divorce and financial struggles and family disappointment had convinced me that I was somehow less worthy of respect and consideration than other people. Part 8. The Unexpected Call. 3 days passed in the peaceful rhythm that Sophia and I had established in our small apartment, a routine built around genuine connection rather than performance or pretense. We made breakfast together each morning, worked on a jigsaw puzzle that had been sitting half-finished on our dining table for weeks, and spent time reading stories that transported us to worlds where kindness was the norm rather than the exception. The absence of family drama felt like a weight lifted from our shoulders, allowing us to remember what happiness could feel like when it wasn't constantly threatened by criticism or conditional approval. On the 4th morning after Christmas, my phone rang while Sophia was in her bedroom, organizing the art supplies she had received from her teacher as an end-of-semester gift. The caller ID showed my mother's name, and my first instinct was to let it go to voicemail, rather than risk having the peace we had found shattered by another round of justifications or accusations. But something made me pause. Perhaps curiosity about whether Patricia had found the courage to acknowledge what had happened, or maybe just the stubborn hope that she might have learned something from Sophia's powerful message. When I answered, my mother's voice sounded different than I had ever heard it before. Gone was the confident authority that usually characterized her phone calls, replaced by something that sounded almost fragile, uncertain in a way that was completely foreign to the woman who had raised me to believe that uncertainty was a sign of weakness. "Jessica," she began, then stopped as if she had rehearsed an opening but forgotten the words when the moment actually arrived. "I've been looking at Sophia's drawing every day since Christmas. I put it on my kitchen table where I have to see it every time I sit down for a meal, and it's been difficult to ignore what she was trying to tell me." The admission surprised me with its honesty. I had expected defensiveness or attempts to minimize what had happened. But instead, Patricia seemed to be genuinely grappling with the implications of her behavior in a way that suggested real self-reflection rather than damage control. "That little girl sees things that adults miss," she continued, her voice carrying a note of wonder that suggested she was still processing the depth of Sophia's insight. The way she positioned everyone in that drawing, the way she showed me sitting, apart from the family while everyone else was connected. It forced me to see myself from the outside, and I didn't like what I saw. I waited for her to continue, unsure whether this was the beginning of a genuine apology or simply another attempt to manipulate the situation to her advantage. Patricia had always been skilled at using emotional language to achieve her goals, and I had learned to be cautious about accepting her words at face value without seeing corresponding changes in behavior. "I realize now that I've been punishing you for choices that actually showed strength and integrity," she said, the words coming slowly as if each one required significant effort to speak aloud. "When you left David, I was disappointed because I thought you were throwing away security and status that most women would kill for. I couldn't understand why you would choose to struggle financially rather than overlook his affairs and maintain the lifestyle you had built together." The acknowledgement was more direct than anything she had ever said about my divorce, and hearing her finally name the real source of her disappointment was both validating and painful. For years, I had suspected that her criticism of my parenting and life choices was really about her inability to accept my decision to prioritize emotional health over material comfort. But she had never been willing to admit that her disapproval was rooted in fundamental disagreements about what mattered most in life. But watching Sophia handle what happened on Christmas night made me realize that you raised her to have exactly the kind of courage and wisdom that I failed to recognize in you, Patricia continued. She could have cried or thrown a tantrum or demanded to know why she was being excluded. But instead, she found a way to teach all of us about empathy and inclusion without ever being cruel or vindictive. That kind of emotional intelligence doesn't develop by accident. It comes from having a mother who models grace under pressure and teaches her children to respond to injustice with wisdom rather than anger. The praise for my parenting was unexpected and deeply moving, partly because it was so rare to receive recognition for the aspects of motherhood that felt most important to me. Patricia had always focused on external measures of success when evaluating my performance as a parent, commenting on Sophia's grades or behavior in public, while seemingly oblivious to the more subtle work of developing character and emotional resilience. "I've also been thinking about what Rachel said that night," Patricia continued, her voice growing stronger as she apparently found her footing in this difficult conversation. Her comment about disappointment and life choices was cruel and unnecessary, and I should have stopped her immediately instead of adding my own hurtful remarks to the pile. I let my own disappointments cloud my judgment about what kind of grandmother I wanted to be, and I used your daughter as a weapon in conflicts that had nothing to do with her. The admission of complicity was significant because it showed that she understood the systemic nature of what had happened rather than treating it as an isolated incident. Too often, family conflicts get minimized as simple misunderstandings or moments of poor judgment, when they're actually symptoms of deeper patterns that require genuine change rather than superficial apologies. "I know that saying sorry isn't enough to undo the damage that was done," she said, her voice becoming more emotional as she worked toward what seemed to be the real purpose of her call. "But I want you to know that I've been having some very difficult conversations with myself about the kind of person I've become and the kind of relationships I want to have with my family going forward. I found myself holding my breath, afraid to hope too much but unable to completely dismiss the possibility that this conversation might represent a genuine turning point rather than just another false start in our complicated relationship." The pain of Christmas night was still fresh, but so was the memory of watching my mother's face as she looked at Sophia's drawing and seemed to really see herself for the first time in years. "What I'm trying to say," Patricia continued after a long pause, is that I would like the chance to try again with both of you, if you're willing to give me that opportunity. I want to earn back the right to be Sophia's grandmother in ways that actually matter, not just through expensive gifts or formal occasions, but through the kind of consistent love and support that she deserves. The request was humble in a way that was completely unlike the woman who had raised me. Stripped of the imperious authority that usually characterized her interactions with family members who had disappointed her, there was something almost vulnerable in her tone, as if she was genuinely uncertain about whether I would be willing to risk further hurt by giving her another chance to prove that she had learned from her mistakes. "I don't expect you to trust me immediately," she added when I didn't respond right away. "I know that words are easy, and that I'll need to show you through my actions that I'm serious about changing the way I treat both of you. But I'm hoping you'll give me the chance to prove that Sophia's lesson wasn't wasted on me, that I can become the kind of grandmother who adds love to her life rather than teaching her that acceptance has to be earned." Part 9. Testing the waters. The conversation with my mother left me feeling cautiously hopeful, but also deeply uncertain about how to move forward. Years of disappointment had taught me to be wary of promises made in moments of emotional clarity, knowing that good intentions often evaporate when tested by the messy realities of daily life and ingrained patterns of behavior. But there had been something different in Patricia's voice, a quality of genuine humility that I had never heard before, that made me wonder if Sophia's Christmas gift might have created the kind of profound shift that actually leads to lasting change. I spent the rest of that day thinking about second chances and the difference between forgiveness and foolishness, between giving someone an opportunity to prove they've changed and setting yourself up for another round of the same disappointments. The conversation had stirred up emotions that I had been working hard to resolve since Christmas night, forcing me to confront my own complex feelings about family loyalty and self-protection. When Sophia came home from her first day back at school after winter break, I told her about her grandmother's phone call, being careful to present the information in a way that wouldn't pressure her to feel any particular way about Patricia's apparent change of heart. Children should never be burdened with the responsibility of managing adult relationships or made to feel guilty for having complicated feelings about people who have hurt them. "She said she's been looking at your drawing every day," I explained as we sat at our small kitchen table sharing an after-school snack of apple slices and peanut butter. "And she thinks it helped her understand some things about how her choices affect other people. She wants to know if we might be willing to give her another chance to be a better grandmother." Sophia considered this information with the same thoughtful attention she gave to math problems or science experiments, clearly weighing different factors before forming her opinion. Her ability to process complex emotional situations without becoming overwhelmed or reactive continued to amaze me, demonstrating a level of emotional intelligence that seemed far beyond her years. "What do you think, Mom?" she asked after a few moments of reflection. "Do you believe she really wants to change? Or do you think she just felt bad for a little while and now she wants things to go back to the way they were before?" Her question cut straight to the heart of my own uncertainty, demonstrating that she understood the difference between genuine transformation and temporary remorse. It also showed that she was looking to me for guidance about how to navigate this situation, trusting my judgment about people and relationships in a way that made me feel both honored and terrified of making the wrong choice. "I think she sounded different than I've ever heard her sound before," I said honestly. "More humble, more willing to admit that she was wrong. But you're right that people sometimes feel sorry about their choices without actually being ready to change their behavior. That's why if we decide to give her another chance, we'll need to be very careful about protecting ourselves and making sure that any changes are real and lasting." Sophia nodded seriously, apparently understanding that adult relationships often require the kind of cautious optimism that hopes for the best while preparing for disappointment. "Maybe we could see her somewhere neutral first," she suggested with the kind of practical wisdom that sometimes emerges from children who have learned to navigate complicated family dynamics. Like at a restaurant or park, somewhere that doesn't feel like her territory or ours, so we can all practice being different without too much pressure. Her suggestion was brilliant in its simplicity, creating a framework for rebuilding trust that acknowledged the risks while still leaving room for genuine connection if Patricia was truly committed to change. It also demonstrated Sophia's sophisticated understanding of power dynamics and the importance of creating safe spaces for vulnerable conversations. 2 days later, I called my mother back and proposed meeting for lunch at a casual restaurant that none of us had particular associations with, neutral territory where we could test the waters of this potential reconciliation without the weight of history that came with gathering in anyone's home. Patricia agreed immediately, her eagerness to accept any terms I offered suggesting that she understood how fragile this opportunity was, and how easily it could be lost if she approached it with her usual expectations of control. The restaurant we chose was a family-friendly place in Central Phoenix that specialized in comfort food and had the kind of relaxed atmosphere that welcomed children without making them feel like they needed to be unnaturally quiet or well-behaved. Sophia and I arrived a few minutes early and chose a corner booth that would allow us to have a private conversation, while still being surrounded by the gentle buzz of other families enjoying their meals. When Patricia walked through the restaurant doors, I was struck by how different she looked from the confident matriarch who had orchestrated Christmas morning just a week earlier. She was dressed more casually than usual, in simple slacks and a sweater rather than the designer clothes that were usually her armor against the world. Her makeup was understated, and there was something about her posture that suggested uncertainty rather than the imperial authority that typically characterized her public appearances. She approached our table with obvious nervousness, her eyes moving between Sophia and me as if she was trying to gauge our moods and adjust her approach accordingly. When she reached the booth, she paused for a moment before sliding into the seat across from us, her movements careful and deliberate in a way that suggested she was acutely aware of how much was riding on this interaction. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," she said, her voice carrying the same quality of humility that had surprised me during our phone conversation. "I wasn't sure you would be willing to give me this chance, and I want you to know how much it means to me that you're here." Sophia studied her grandmother with those perceptive brown eyes, taking in the changes in her appearance and demeanor with the kind of careful attention that children use when they're trying to determine whether an adult can be trusted. After a long moment, she offered a small smile that was cautious but not unfriendly. "Hi, Grandma Patricia," she said simply. "I'm glad you wanted to see us again. I was worried that my drawing might have made you too sad to want to be around me anymore." The comment was so innocent and generous that it brought tears to Patricia's eyes, apparently touching something deep inside her that had been protected by years of pride and defensiveness. She reached across the table as if to take Sophia's hand, then stopped herself, apparently recognizing that physical affection needed to be earned rather than assumed. "Your drawing wasn't too sad, sweetheart," she said softly. It was too true. And sometimes the truth is uncomfortable for grown-ups who haven't been making good choices. But uncomfortable truths are also gifts, because they give us the chance to become better people if we're brave enough to listen to them. The acknowledgement was exactly what Sophia needed to hear. Validation that her artistic message had been received and understood rather than dismissed or minimized. It also demonstrated that Patricia was approaching this conversation with genuine awareness of what had happened, rather than trying to gloss over the events that had brought us to this point. As we ordered our meals and began the careful work of rebuilding trust, I found myself cautiously optimistic that this might actually represent the beginning of genuine change, rather than just another false start in our complicated family history. But I also remained vigilant, ready to protect both Sophia and myself if this apparent transformation proved to be temporary or superficial. Part 10. Small Steps Forward. The lunch conversation unfolded with a delicate carefulness that reminded me of people learning to walk again after a serious injury. each step deliberate and uncertain but moving in the direction of healing. Patricia asked thoughtful questions about Sophia's school and her friends, showing genuine interest in the details of her granddaughter's daily life, rather than just the achievements and milestones that had previously captured her attention. There was something different about the quality of her listening, as if she was really hearing the answers rather than simply waiting for her turn to speak. When Sophia told her about the science project she was working on, a study of plant growth under different lighting conditions, Patricia's eyes lit up with what appeared to be authentic fascination rather than the polite interest she had shown in the past. She asked follow-up questions that demonstrated she was actually processing the information, wanting to understand not just what Sophia was learning, but how she felt about the discovery process and what aspects of the project excited her most. "I used to love gardening when you were little, Jessica," Patricia said, turning to me with a wistful expression that suggested she was remembering a version of herself that had been buried under years of social positioning and performance. "I had a whole section of the backyard dedicated to vegetables, and I spent hours out there with my hands in the dirt, watching things grow. I don't know why I stopped doing that. Maybe I got too concerned with how the yard looked to the neighbors, instead of how it felt to be working in it." The admission was revealing in ways that went beyond gardening, suggesting that she was beginning to recognize how much of her life had been shaped by external expectations rather than internal satisfaction. The woman who had spent years criticizing my choices for not meeting her standards of social acceptability was apparently starting to question whether those standards had cost her more than they had gained. Sophia seized on this opening with the enthusiasm she always showed when discovering connections with other people. "We could start a garden together sometime if you want," she offered generously. "Mom and I have been talking about trying to grow herbs on our balcony, but we don't really know how to begin. Maybe you could teach us what you remember about making things grow." The suggestion was so perfectly pitched between invitation and boundary that I marveled at my daughter's instinctive understanding of how to rebuild relationships without making herself vulnerable to further hurt. She was offering her grandmother a role in her life while maintaining control over the terms of engagement, creating space for connection while protecting herself from disappointment. Patricia's response was immediate and emotional, her face lighting up with the kind of joy that seemed to transform her entire appearance. "I would love that more than you can imagine," she said, her voice thick with feelings that she was clearly struggling to contain. "I could bring you some of my old gardening books, and we could start planning what kinds of herbs would work best in containers. There's something magical about watching seeds turn into something you can actually use in cooking." As the meal progressed, we found ourselves talking about practical things like soil types and drainage, and the difference between herbs that needed full sun versus those that could tolerate partial shade. The conversation felt normal in a way that our family interactions hadn't felt in years, focused on shared interests rather than judgment or performance, or the complex web of disappointments that had characterized our relationship for so long. But it was when the check arrived that Patricia demonstrated the most significant change in her approach to our relationship. Instead of insisting on paying for lunch in the imperious way that had always made her generosity feel like another form of control, she simply asked if she could treat us to the meal as a small gesture of appreciation for giving her this chance to reconnect. "I know that buying lunch doesn't make up for the hurt I've caused," she said carefully, "but I want to do small things that show my gratitude for your willingness to let me try to be better, if that feels okay to both of you." The request was so different from her usual assumptions of authority that it took me a moment to process what was happening. She was asking permission rather than making demands, acknowledging the power dynamics that had been shifted by her behavior and my response to it. The weeks that followed our restaurant lunch became a careful dance of rebuilding trust, with each interaction serving as both a test and an opportunity for my mother to demonstrate that her apparent transformation was rooted in genuine change rather than temporary remorse. Patricia began calling every few days, not with the demanding expectation of immediate forgiveness that had characterized her past attempts at reconciliation, but with tentative offers to spend time together, that always included explicit acknowledgement that we had every right to say no. Her first gesture came in the form of a small package delivered to our apartment, containing 3 packets of herb seeds, along with a handwritten note that was unlike anything she had ever sent before. Instead of her usual formal tone, the letter was filled with specific memories about the garden she had maintained when I was young, stories about the satisfaction she had found in nurturing plants from seedlings to harvest, and honest reflections about how she had gradually abandoned that hobby in favor of activities that looked more impressive to her social circle. The seeds themselves were carefully chosen varieties that would thrive in container gardens, accompanied by detailed instructions written in Patricia's distinctive handwriting that explained everything from soil preparation to watering schedules. But what struck me most was the personal note she had included with each packet, sharing memories about how we had used these particular herbs in family meals when I was growing up, connecting the practical gift to emotional history in ways that felt authentic rather than manipulative. Sophia was enchanted by the idea of starting our balcony garden, and we spent an entire Saturday afternoon preparing containers and planting seeds while talking about the different ways we might use fresh herbs in our cooking. There was something deeply satisfying about working with soil and water, creating the conditions for growth while having no control over whether the seeds would actually sprout. The metaphor wasn't lost on me as I considered my own relationship with my mother, understanding that I could provide opportunities for healing while accepting that the ultimate success of our reconciliation would depend on factors beyond my control. When Patricia asked if she could visit to see how our herbs were progressing, I agreed, but established clear boundaries about the visit that reflected the cautious optimism I was feeling about our relationship. She could come for 2 hours on Sunday afternoon. We would focus our time together on the garden project, and she would leave promptly when the agreed-upon time was over. The structure wasn't meant to be punitive, but rather to create a safe framework for rebuilding connection without overwhelming anyone with too much intensity too quickly. The visit exceeded my expectations in ways that suggested Patricia was genuinely committed to earning back her place in our lives, rather than simply resuming the role she had always assumed was rightfully hers. She arrived with a small trowel and a watering can that she had brought from her own gardening supplies, tools that showed actual use rather than the pristine perfection of items purchased specifically for this occasion. Her clothes were practical, rather than designer, and she seemed genuinely excited about the prospect of getting her hands dirty while working alongside us. More significantly, she spent the entire visit focused on Sophia and the garden project, asking questions about which plants were showing the most growth, listening carefully to Sophia's observations about the differences between the herbs, and sharing gentle corrections and suggestions that felt like teaching rather than criticism. There was no mention of my life choices, no subtle digs about our living situation, no comparison between our modest balcony garden and the elaborate landscaping that surrounded her own home. When our time together was drawing to a close, Patricia made a request that surprised me with its humility and awareness of the new dynamics in our relationship. She asked if she could take a photograph of Sophia with the herbs we had planted together, not for social media or to show off to her friends, but simply to keep for herself as a reminder of this new beginning we were tentatively exploring. "I want to remember this afternoon exactly as it was," she said softly, adjusting her phone to capture Sophia's proud smile as she held up a container where tiny green shoots were just beginning to emerge from the soil. Not because it was perfect or impressive, but because it felt real in a way that our time together hasn't felt in years. This is the kind of grandmother I want to be, and the kind of memories I want us all to have. The photograph became the first in what would eventually grow into a new collection of images that documented our gradual reconnection. Pictures that captured ordinary moments of genuine connection rather than the formal family portraits that had previously defined our visual history. These were photos of Sophia teaching Patricia how to make friendship bracelets, of the 3 of us working together to transplant herbs into larger containers as they outgrew their original homes, of quiet conversations over simple meals that focused on sharing experiences rather than performing success. As spring turned into summer, Our rebuilding relationship developed a rhythm that felt sustainable rather than forced. Patricia began joining us for monthly visits that always included some kind of shared activity, whether it was working in our expanding container garden, cooking meals together using the herbs we had grown, or exploring local farmers markets, where we could learn about different varieties of plants and vegetables. These outings were deliberately chosen to focus our attention on present moment experiences, rather than the complicated history that had brought us to this point. The real test of Patricia's transformation came during what should have been a moment of crisis in our relationship. Sophia had been invited to a birthday party for one of her classmates at an expensive entertainment center that was far beyond our budget, the kind of elaborate celebration that had always prompted subtle comments from my mother about the advantages that other children enjoyed. When Sophia mentioned the party during one of our Sunday visits, I braced myself for the familiar criticism about my inability to provide similar experiences for my daughter. Instead, Patricia's response demonstrated the depth of change that had been occurring gradually over the months we had been rebuilding our relationship. She listened carefully as Sophia described the party plans, asked thoughtful questions about what kinds of activities would be available, and then offered to contribute to the cost of the admission fee in a way that felt supportive rather than condescending. "I know that birthday parties can be expensive," she said directly to me, "and I'd like to help make it possible for Sophia to attend if that feels okay to you. Not because I think you should need my help, but because I want to be the kind of grandmother who contributes to her granddaughter's happiness when I have the opportunity to do so." The offer was made without any strings attached or implications about my financial limitations, simply a straightforward expression of her desire to participate positively in Sophia's life. When I accepted her contribution gratefully, she seemed genuinely pleased rather than smugly satisfied, as if the opportunity to help was a gift she had been given, rather than a demonstration of her superiority. More importantly, when Sophia returned from the party with stories about the games she had played and the friends she had spent time with, Patricia listened with the same engaged attention she would have given to any other experience her granddaughter wanted to share. There was no attempt to analyze whether the party had been worth the expense, or to use the occasion as a teaching moment about financial responsibility. She simply celebrated Sophia's joy without attaching any larger meaning to the experience. These small interactions began to accumulate into a new pattern of relationship that felt genuinely different from anything we had experienced before. Patricia was learning to offer support without control, to express love without conditions, to be present in our lives without trying to reshape them according to her own vision of what they should look like. The grandmother who emerged from this process of change was someone I was genuinely beginning to enjoy spending time with, rather than someone I endured out of obligation or guilt. Darcy Wine. Part 12. Healing the Wider Circle. The transformation in my relationship with Patricia began to have ripple effects throughout our extended family, creating opportunities for healing that I hadn't anticipated when we first began the careful work of rebuilding trust. Rachel noticed the changes in our mother's behavior and began asking questions about how our reconciliation was progressing, apparently curious about whether the same possibilities for renewal might exist in other damaged family relationships. The conversation came during a chance encounter at the grocery store, one of those awkward moments when you run into someone you're avoiding while wearing sweatpants and trying to remember whether you need milk or bread. Rachel approached me, cautiously, her usual confident demeanor replaced by something that looked almost nervous as she attempted to navigate a conversation that neither of us had expected to have. "Mom told me that you and Sophia have been spending time together," she said, her tone carefully neutral in a way that suggested she was testing the waters rather than making assumptions about my willingness to engage with her. "She seems different lately. Happier, I guess, but also more thoughtful about things that she used to just brush off." I confirmed that we had been gradually rebuilding our relationship, but kept my response brief and non-committal, unsure whether Rachel was genuinely interested in understanding what had happened or simply gathering information that she could use for her own purposes. Years of experience had taught me to be cautious about sharing vulnerable information with someone who had consistently used my openness as ammunition against me. But as our conversation continued, Rachel began to reveal her own complex feelings about the family dynamics that had shaped all of our relationships. She admitted that watching Patricia's obvious joy about spending time with Sophia had made her reflect on her own interactions with her children, wondering whether her focus on achievement and appearance was creating the same kind of conditional love that had damaged our family relationships for generations. "I keep thinking about that night at Christmas," she said quietly, glancing around the produce section as if afraid someone might overhear her moment of vulnerability. "The way Jake and Emma responded to Sophia's gifts, how genuinely happy they were about things that had obviously been made with love rather than bought with money. I realized that my kids rarely make anything for other people anymore, and I'm wondering if that's because I've taught them that only expensive gifts matter." The admission was more honest than anything Rachel had ever shared with me about her parenting concerns, and I found myself responding with cautious empathy rather than the defensive anger that had characterized our interactions for years. She was beginning to question some of the same assumptions about success and worth that had poisoned our family relationships, and her willingness to admit uncertainty seemed like a genuine opening for connection. When she asked if she could bring Jake and Emma to visit Sophia sometime, I agreed, but established the same careful boundaries that had made Patricia's re-entry into our lives possible. The children could visit for a specific amount of time. We would focus on activities that brought out the best in everyone involved, and any adults who accompanied them would need to commit to supporting rather than undermining the positive atmosphere we were trying to create. The visit was tentatively scheduled for a Saturday afternoon when our herb garden was at its most abundant, providing a natural focus for the children's attention while giving the adults something constructive to do with their hands. Sophia was excited about the prospect of showing her cousins how much our plants had grown, and she spent the morning before their arrival carefully selecting the best examples of each herb so that Jake and Emma could see the full range of what we had accomplished together. When they arrived, the children fell easily into the kind of natural connection that had always existed between them, despite the adult conflicts that had complicated their family relationships. Jake was genuinely impressed by the garden project, asking detailed questions about how different plants had responded to various growing conditions and expressing interest in starting a similar project at his own home. Emma was fascinated by the friendship bracelets that Sophia had continued making since Christmas, and the two girls spent part of the afternoon working together to create new designs while talking about school and friends and the kinds of ordinary concerns that children share when they're not burdened by adult expectations. Rachel spent most of the visit quietly observing her children's interactions with Sophia, apparently noting the ways that unstructured play brought out creativity and generosity that she rarely saw during their usual highly scheduled activities. When Jake spontaneously offered to help Sophia water the plants without being asked, or when Emma shared her snacks without expecting anything in return, Rachel seemed to be taking mental notes about the conditions that fostered these positive behaviors. The real breakthrough came when Emma asked if she could take some herb seeds home to start her own small garden, not because she wanted to compete with Sophia's success, but because she was genuinely inspired by the satisfaction her cousin had found in nurturing plants from beginning to harvest. The request led to a collaborative planning session, where all three children worked together to determine which varieties would be most suitable for Emma's available space and growing conditions. Watching them collaborate without rivalry or comparison, I was reminded of what family relationships could look like when they weren't poisoned by competition and conditional approval. These children naturally supported each other's interests and celebrated each other's successes when the adults in their lives created environments that rewarded cooperation rather than individual achievement at the expense of others. By the end of the visit, Rachel was making tentative inquiries about whether we might be able to get together again sometime, perhaps for an activity that would allow all the children to continue developing their gardening skills while giving the adults more opportunities to model healthier relationship patterns. Her suggestions were carefully framed as invitations rather than expectations, demonstrating that she was beginning to understand the difference between controlling relationships and nurturing them. The changes in Rachel's approach became even more evident during subsequent interactions, as she began making different choices about how to engage with both her own children and with Sophia during family gatherings. Instead of focusing conversations on achievements and acquisitions, she started asking questions about experiences and feelings, creating space for the children to share what mattered to them rather than performing what they thought adults wanted to hear. When Jake struggled with a challenging school project, instead of immediately jumping in with solutions or criticisms, Rachel began encouraging him to brainstorm different approaches and to seek help from peers who might have different strengths. When Emma expressed interest in learning to cook, Rachel arranged for them to spend time in the kitchen together, experimenting with recipes that used herbs from their new garden, focusing on the process of discovery rather than the perfection of results. These shifts in family dynamics created a ripple effect that extended beyond our immediate relationships, influencing how holidays and gatherings were planned and executed. Instead of the formal, performance-oriented celebrations that had characterized our family traditions for years, we began experimenting with more relaxed gatherings that prioritized connection over impression management. The first test of these new approaches came during Sophia's 8th birthday party, when I decided to invite both Patricia and Rachel's family to a simple celebration at a local park, rather than the elaborate events that had become standard in our extended family. The party featured homemade decorations, potluck food contributions, and activities that encouraged creativity rather than consumption. Instead of expensive gift exchanges, I suggested that anyone who wanted to give Sophia a present should consider making something or contributing to an experience rather than purchasing items. The response exceeded my expectations, with Jake creating a hand-illustrated storybook about gardening adventures, Emma designing a collection of friendship bracelets in Sophia's favorite colors, and Patricia bringing seeds and supplies for expanding our container garden to include vegetables in addition to herbs. The party itself became a celebration of the relationships we had been rebuilding rather than a display of wealth or social status. Children played games that required cooperation rather than competition. Adults engaged in conversations that focused on shared interests rather than individual achievements, and everyone seemed more relaxed and genuinely happy than they had been during formal family gatherings in years. Part 13. The New Foundation. As Sophia's 8th birthday party drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on the remarkable transformation that had occurred in our family relationships over the past several months. The afternoon had unfolded with an ease and genuine warmth that would have been unimaginable during the tense, performance-oriented gatherings that had characterized our interactions for so many years. Children played together without the undercurrent of adult judgment that had previously made them cautious about expressing themselves freely, and conversations flowed naturally between topics that interested people rather than subjects designed to impress or intimidate. The most striking change was visible in Patricia herself, who spent the entire party focused on connecting with her grandchildren rather than managing appearances or demonstrating her authority over family decisions. She sat on the grass with genuine comfort, her expensive clothes replaced by practical garments that could withstand playground dirt and grass stains. When little Ben spilled juice on her shirt during an enthusiastic hug, she laughed instead of expressing the horror that such accidents had previously generated. More significantly, she seemed to be taking real pleasure in watching Sophia navigate her birthday celebration with the kind of gracious confidence that had emerged as our home environment became more stable and supportive. Instead of the anxious, people-pleasing that had characterized Sophia's behavior during past family gatherings, she was able to express her preferences clearly, accept compliments without embarrassment, and include other children in activities without sacrificing her own enjoyment. The gift-opening portion of the party provided a powerful contrast to the traumatic Christmas experience that had catalyzed our family's transformation. Instead of expensive items chosen to demonstrate financial status, the presents reflected genuine knowledge of Sophia's interests and personality. Each gift came with a story about why the giver had chosen that particular item, creating connections between people rather than simply transferring objects from one person to another. When Sophia opened Jake's handmade storybook, her face lit up with the kind of joy that can't be manufactured or purchased. The book represented hours of his time and attention, illustrations that captured details about her personality that could only come from genuine observation and care. Her response was equally generous, immediately suggesting that they could work together to create additional stories featuring characters from their shared experiences. Emma's friendship bracelets sparked a collaborative discussion about different patterns and techniques, with Sophia offering to teach her cousin some of the more complex designs she had developed since Christmas. The exchange highlighted the way that handmade gifts create ongoing connections between people, rather than simply marking a single moment of generosity. But it was Patricia's gift that demonstrated the depth of change in her understanding of what her granddaughter truly valued. Instead of expensive toys or elaborate gadgets, she had created a memory book filled with photographs and stories from our recent times together, documenting the gradual rebuilding of their relationship through images of ordinary moments that had become precious because they represented genuine connection. Each page included handwritten notes about what Patricia had observed during their shared activities, celebrating Sophia's curiosity, kindness, and resilience, rather than focusing on conventional achievements. The book was simultaneously a gift for Sophia and a testament to Patricia's own growth, evidence that she had learned to see and value qualities that couldn't be measured by external standards. The final pages of the memory book were left blank, with a note explaining that they were meant to be filled with future adventures and discoveries as their relationship continued to develop. The message was clear. This wasn't meant to be a commemoration of something completed, but rather the beginning of something that would continue growing and evolving over time. As guests began to leave the party, the cleanup process became another opportunity for connection rather than a chore to be endured. Children worked alongside adults to gather decorations and dispose of trash, their natural helpfulness encouraged, rather than dismissed as inadequate or unnecessary. The collaborative effort felt like a natural extension of the celebration itself, everyone contributing to the restoration of the park space while continuing conversations and connections that had been sparked during the party. Rachel lingered after most of the other guests had departed, apparently wanting to extend the positive experience rather than rushing back to the scheduled activities that usually filled her family's weekends. She helped pack leftover food and supplies while talking with Sophia about the success of the container garden project and making tentative plans for future collaborations between the cousins. "This felt different from other family gatherings," she said as we loaded the final items into our cars. "More relaxed, I guess, but also more real. The kids seemed like themselves instead of trying to impress anyone, and I realized that I was enjoying myself instead of worrying about whether everything was going according to plan." Her observation captured something important about the changes that had occurred in our family dynamics over the past months. By removing the pressure to perform success according to external standards, we had created space for authentic relationships to emerge. Children could express genuine enthusiasm without fear of being criticized for being too loud or energetic. Adults could acknowledge uncertainties without being seen as failures. And everyone could contribute according to their actual abilities rather than idealized expectations. Patricia was the last to leave, taking time to help Sophia arrange her new gifts in her bedroom and to water the herbs that had become symbols of their renewed relationship. Their interaction had a comfortable rhythm that spoke to the trust they had gradually rebuilt, with Sophia freely sharing her thoughts and feelings while Patricia listened with genuine attention rather than preparing judgments or advice. "Thank you for giving me the chance to be part of this," Patricia said to me as she prepared to leave. "Not just the party, but everything that led up to it. I know that I had to earn the right to be here, and I'm grateful that you and Sophia were willing to let me try to become the kind of grandmother who deserves to be included in moments like this." Her gratitude was expressed without the underlying expectation of reciprocal appreciation that had characterized her past attempts at relationship repair. She seemed to understand that rebuilding trust was an ongoing process rather than a single achievement, and that maintaining these positive changes would require continued attention and effort, rather than simply resuming old patterns of interaction. As I watched her drive away from the park, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. The painful Christmas experience that had initially seemed like a complete rupture in our family relationships had actually created the conditions for more authentic connections than we had ever experienced before. By refusing to accept treatment that diminished our worth, Sophia and I had forced everyone to confront the difference between genuine love and conditional approval. The transformation hadn't been quick or easy, requiring months of careful boundary setting and gradual trust building before we reached a point where celebration felt natural rather than forced. But the foundation we had established felt solid in a way that our previous family relationships never had, built on honesty and respect rather than obligation and performance. Part 14. The Gift That Keeps Giving. 1 year after the Christmas, that changed everything. Sophia and I found ourselves preparing for another holiday season with a sense of anticipation rather than the dread that had characterized previous years. Our small apartment was decorated with a mixture of store-bought ornaments and handmade creations that reflected the artistic skills Sophia had continued developing throughout the year, each piece telling a story about experiences we had shared or people who mattered to us. The container garden that had begun as a tentative peace offering between Patricia and us had evolved into a thriving ecosystem that now included vegetables, flowers, and an expanded variety of herbs that we used in cooking throughout the year. The plants had become a metaphor for our family relationships, requiring consistent attention and care, but rewarding that investment with growth that exceeded our original expectations. Our Christmas plans reflected the new family dynamics that had emerged from the ashes of the previous year's disaster. Instead of gathering at Patricia's formal house for an elaborate meal that emphasized material display over emotional connection, we had decided to host a simple celebration at our apartment, with each person contributing something meaningful rather than expensive to the shared experience. The guest list included Patricia and Rachel's family, but the invitation had been extended with clear expectations about the kind of behavior that would make everyone feel welcome and valued. This wasn't meant to be punitive, but rather to ensure that the positive changes we had all worked to develop wouldn't be undermined by a return to old patterns of competition and conditional approval. Sophia had spent weeks preparing handmade gifts for each person, building on the skills she had developed over the past year while incorporating new techniques she had learned through art classes and online tutorials. Her presents weren't elaborate or expensive, but they reflected deep knowledge of each recipient's interests and personality, demonstrating the kind of thoughtful attention that creates lasting emotional connections. For Jake, she had created a detailed guidebook about container gardening that included illustrations of different plant varieties, along with practical advice about growing conditions and care requirements. The book incorporated lessons they had learned together during their collaborative gardening experiments, making it simultaneously educational and personal. Emma's gift was a collection of friendship bracelets that told the story of their renewed relationship through colors and patterns that referenced shared experiences and inside jokes. Each bracelet came with a small card explaining its significance, creating a wearable narrative about the ways their connection had deepened over the past year. Ben received a sequel to the superhero comic book Sophia had created for him the previous Christmas, featuring new adventures that incorporated interests he had developed during the intervening months. The stories showed how much attention Sophia had paid to his evolving personality and preferences, celebrating his growth while maintaining continuity with themes that had captured his imagination. But it was Patricia's gift that represented the most significant evolution in Sophia's understanding of relationships and forgiveness. Instead of another drawing that highlighted past problems, she had created a photo album documenting all the positive experiences they had shared since beginning their reconciliation process. Each page included handwritten reflections about what she had learned from their time together, celebrating not just their renewed relationship, but Patricia's willingness to change and grow. The album's final pages contained space for future additions, with a note explaining that the best gifts are those that continue developing over time rather than representing single moments of generosity. The message was clear. Their relationship was no longer defined by past hurts, but by ongoing opportunities for connection and mutual support. When Christmas morning arrived, our celebration unfolded with the kind of natural ease that comes when people are focused on genuine connection rather than managing appearances. Gifts were exchanged with attention to the stories behind them rather than their monetary value, creating conversations about shared experiences and future possibilities, rather than comparisons about who had received the most expensive items. Patricia's gift to Sophia was particularly meaningful, consisting of a set of professional quality art supplies, along with an enrollment in a summer art program that would allow her to develop her creative talents while connecting with other young artists. The gift demonstrated Patricia's growing understanding of what truly mattered to her granddaughter, supporting her natural abilities rather than trying to redirect her interests toward more conventional pursuits. More importantly, Patricia had included a handwritten letter that acknowledged the role Sophia had played in transforming their entire family's understanding of love and acceptance. The letter was addressed to Sophia, but clearly intended for all of us to read. A public recognition of the wisdom and courage she had demonstrated by refusing to accept treatment that diminished her worth. "You taught me that real strength isn't about having power over other people," the letter read in part, "but about having the courage to show love even when love isn't being shown to you. Your Christmas drawing last year was the mirror I needed to see myself clearly, and everything good that has happened in our family since then started with your decision to respond to exclusion with inclusion, to answer cruelty with kindness." The letter went on to acknowledge the specific ways that Sophia's example had influenced other family members, creating ripple effects that had improved relationships throughout our extended network of connections. Patricia's recognition of these changes felt genuine rather than performative, evidence that she truly understood the magnitude of transformation that had occurred. As the day progressed, we found ourselves naturally gravitating toward activities that emphasized collaboration rather than competition. Children and adults worked together to prepare meals using herbs from our expanded garden, sharing stories about the different ways various plants had been used in family recipes over the years. The conversation flowed easily between generations, with everyone contributing knowledge and experiences that enriched the collective understanding. When afternoon settled into evening, we gathered around our small tree to share reflections about the past year and hopes for the future. Each person was invited to contribute something meaningful rather than being required to participate, creating space for authentic expression without pressure or expectation. Sophia chose to read a short story she had written about a family that learned to love each other better by paying attention to what really mattered rather than what looked impressive to other people. The story was clearly inspired by our own experiences, but it was told with enough universality that everyone could see themselves in the characters without feeling judged or criticized for past behavior. The story's ending emphasized themes of growth and possibility rather than resolution and closure, acknowledging that loving relationships require ongoing attention and effort rather than single moments of dramatic change. The message resonated throughout our small living room, creating a sense of shared commitment to continuing the positive trajectory we had established. As our guests prepared to leave that evening, the atmosphere was filled with genuine affection and gratitude rather than the relief that had often characterized the end of previous family gatherings. People lingered to extend conversations and make plans for future connections, apparently reluctant to end an experience that had felt nourishing rather than draining. Patricia was again the last to leave, taking time to help with cleanup while reflecting on how different this Christmas had felt from previous celebrations. Her observations weren't focused on external details like decorations or food, but on the quality of emotional connection that had characterized our time together. "I keep thinking about that drawing you made last year," she said to Sophia as they worked together to gather wrapping paper and ribbons. "How it showed me sitting alone while everyone else was connected. Today, I felt like I was part of the circle instead of outside it, and I know that happened because you and your mother had the courage to insist that love should include everyone rather than leaving some people out." Sophia hugged her grandmother with the comfortable affection that had gradually replaced the careful politeness of their earlier interactions. "I'm glad you learned to see what the drawing was trying to show you," she said simply. "Sometimes it takes a while for grown-ups to understand what kids already know about being fair and kind to everyone." As I watched them embrace, I was struck by the realization that our family's transformation had created exactly the kind of environment I had always wanted Sophia to experience but had never known how to build. She was growing up in a context where love was expressed through actions rather than words, where differences were respected rather than criticized, and where everyone was valued for who they were rather than what they could achieve. The Christmas, that had begun with deliberate exclusion and cruelty, had ultimately taught all of us that authentic relationships require the courage to set boundaries, the wisdom to recognize genuine change, and the generosity to offer second chances when those changes prove to be real and lasting. Most importantly, it had shown us that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important truths, and that children often understand better than adults what family is supposed to feel like. Standing in our small living room surrounded by the evidence of genuine celebration rather than performed success, I felt grateful for the difficult journey that had brought us to this point. The pain of the previous Christmas had been real and significant, but it had also created the conditions for building something better than what we had lost. Sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most challenging experiences, teaching us lessons about love and worth that we couldn't have learned any other way. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.